Dive into the latest explosive political saga that has shaken America to its core. Hit like, subscribe, and comment below to join Cal Morgan as he unravels the tangled web of power, deception, and spectacle surrounding Trump, Leavitt, and the nation's turbulent legal and cultural battlegrounds. America stands at the precipice of yet another political firestorm, a maelstrom of power and provocation with familiar faces at its center. Donald Trump, the ever-defiant former president, continues to cast long shadows across the nation's political landscape. His every pronouncement, calculated or impulsive, sends ripples through corridors of power and into living rooms across the heartland. The temperature rises with each passing day. Trump's statements, bold, uncompromising, and frequently incendiary, don't merely suggest conflict, they guarantee it. This is not politics as usual. This is politics as spectacle, as warfare, as identity. In the eye of this storm stands Caroline Leavitt, her voice cutting through the media cacophony with unwavering certainty. A fierce MAGA standard-bearer, Leavitt doesn't merely defend Trump, she amplifies him, transforms his words into doctrine. Her televised appearances have become mandatory viewing for the faithful and object lessons in conviction for his critics. The American people are tired of these baseless attacks on a president who fought for them every day, Leavitt declares, her eyes flashing with practiced indignation. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to distract from the catastrophic failures of the current administration. Yet for every action, there is an equal and opposite response. Enter Robert Dairo, whose analytical precision cuts through the rhetorical fog like a scalpel. Dairo represents a different America, one that demands evidence over emotion, substance over style. What we're witnessing, Dairo observes with clinical detachment, is not leadership but a masterclass in political misdirection. When facts become inconvenient, they're labeled as fake. When institutions uphold the law, they're denounced as corrupt. This playbook is as predictable as it is dangerous. The battle lines are drawn not merely between political opponents, but between competing visions of truth itself. In one version, Trump stands as a persecuted champion of an America under siege from enemies within. In another, he represents the greatest stress test American democracy has faced in generations. As these narratives collide, they create not merely disagreement, but entirely separate realities, each with its own heroes, villains, and moral imperatives. The American people find themselves not merely choosing between policies or parties, but between fundamentally different versions of their national story. This is the landscape we must navigate, where facts fragment into partisan shrapnel, where loyalty trumps veracity, where today's outrage obliterates yesterday's transgressions. The stakes could not be higher, nor the path forward more obscured by the smoke of cultural and political warfare. America watches, waits, and wonders. Will truth prevail or will power? Will accountability matter or only victory? The answers to these questions will define not just the next election cycle, but the very nature of American democracy in the decades to come. But as America's internal political warfare rages, another conflict, quieter yet potentially more devastating, unfolds along its northern border. The once unshakable alliance between the United States and Canada now fractures under the weight of escalating tariffs and diplomatic brinkmanship, sending shockwaves through global markets and border communities alike. What began as rhetorical posturing has transformed into economic artillery, with each new tariff announcement landing like precision-guided munitions on vulnerable industries. Steel mills in Pennsylvania, dairy farms in Wisconsin, lumber operations in British Columbia, all caught in the crossfire of a trade war few saw coming and none can escape. James Blanchard, the former U.S. ambassador to Canada, watches this unfolding catastrophe with the grim recognition of a man witnessing the dismantling of his life's work. His warnings cut through diplomatic niceties with surgical precision. This isn't just about balance sheets and trade deficits, Blanchard explains, his voice carrying the weight of decades of cross-border diplomacy. We're systematically dismantling the most successful bilateral relationship in modern history. The damage we're inflicting won't be measured in months but in generations. The casualties mount with each passing day. In automotive plants across Michigan and Ontario, production lines slow as supply chains buckle under regulatory uncertainty. At border crossings once symbols of North American integration, commercial vehicles now sit idle for hours, their contents depreciating in real time as paperwork multiplies. Consumer prices tell the story that political rhetoric attempts to obscure. In American grocery stores, Canadian seafood and agricultural products vanish from shelves or appear with startling new price tags. The invisible architecture of North American economic integration, built painstakingly over decades, now reveals itself through its systematic dismantling. Behind closed doors, diplomatic channels once characterized by collegiality now seethe with resentment. Canadian officials who once considered themselves privileged partners now find themselves grouped with adversaries, their century of goodwill collateral damage in a larger geopolitical gambit. We've essentially turned a strategic ally into a strategic problem, observes a senior State Department official speaking on condition of anonymity. And for what? A momentary political advantage? A few applause lines at rallies? The irony escapes no one with historical perspective. Two nations that share the world's longest undefended border now engage in economic hostilities that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The administration's defenders frame this as necessary recalibration. Its critics see reckless endangerment of an irreplaceable partnership. Meanwhile, in communities from Seattle to Maine, where cross-border connections form the fabric of daily life, citizens watch in bewilderment as political abstractions translate into concrete hardships, jobs threatened, family reunions complicated, shared resources suddenly contested. This is diplomacy as demolition, alliance as afterthought. And as the dust settles on each new round of economic retaliation, the fundamental question emerges with increasing urgency. In America's quest to assert dominance on the world stage, has it sacrificed the relationships that made such dominance possible in the first place? As diplomatic fires rage along America's northern border, a new inferno ignites in the digital realm, sparked not by policy papers or formal declarations, but by the glow of a presidential smartphone in the dead of night. At 3:17 a.m. Eastern Time, while most of the nation sleeps, Donald Trump unleashes a barrage of social media proclamations that will reverberate through global markets within hours. His targets, the European Union and Canada, longtime allies now recast as economic adversaries. All products coming into the United States from Europe and Canada will face massive new tariffs starting next week. America first, declares the presidential post, composed in the solitude of the White House residence as financial analysts across multiple time zones scramble to assess potential damage. By dawn, the global response materializes with unprecedented swiftness. In Brussels, emergency meetings convene without American representatives, a visual metaphor for a new geopolitical reality taking shape. The once unthinkable scenario of major Western economies coordinating defensive strategies against American economic aggression now unfolds in real time. We are witnessing the self-imposed isolation of a superpower, observes a senior German trade official, not bothering to lower his voice as American journalists record his assessment. In diplomatic circles, where coded language typically obscures direct criticism, this naked candor signals a fundamental shift in international relations. The ridicule comes next, subtle at first, then increasingly overt. French diplomats exchange knowing glances during press conferences. Canadian officials respond with uncharacteristic sarcasm. Even the typically reserved Japanese delegation permits itself thinly veiled references to impulsive decision-making unbecoming of a global leader. Meanwhile, on American soil, economic uncertainty spreads like contagion. Market analysts downgrade growth forecasts. Consumer confidence indices plummet for the fourth consecutive month. Manufacturing executives accelerate contingency planning that had once seemed paranoid but now appears prescient. In boardrooms across America, conversations shift from quarterly projections to existential calculations. A pharmaceutical giant quietly expands its Irish operations. An automotive manufacturer accelerates automation at its Mexican facilities. A technology firm discreetly transitions intellectual property to Singapore subsidiaries. These corporate maneuvers, invisible to most Americans, represent a seismic reallocation of capital away from the very nation whose interests these tariffs purportedly protect. "We're not making political statements," confides the CFO of a Fortune 100 company, speaking anonymously to protect his firm's government contracts. "We're simply adjusting to a business environment where predictability has become a competitive advantage, and predictability no longer resides in the United States." The true cost of these midnight proclamations won't appear in tomorrow's headlines or next quarter's GDP figures. They manifest instead in the gradual erosion of American economic centrality, a position built over generations and now undermined in presidential outbursts, calibrated not for economic benefit, but for emotional catharsis. As dawn breaks over Washington, the social media tempest continues. But beneath the digital sound and fury, a more consequential reality emerges. In the theater of global economics, America increasingly performs to an emptying house. While international markets absorbed the shockwaves of Trump's economic declarations, a darkness of a different nature was taking root in Washington's corridors of power. The nation awoke to a development so troubling it transcended partisan boundaries. Crucial Jeffrey Epstein documents, files that promised to expose powerful figures across political spectrums, had vanished without explanation. Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna stood before a phalanx of cameras, her composed exterior barely containing her fury. "The American people deserve to know who authorized the removal of these files," she demanded, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of Capitol Hill. This isn't about politics. It's about accountability at the highest levels. Behind closed doors, congressional staffers whispered of thumb drives mysteriously wiped clean, of surveillance footage showing unidentified individuals entering secure archives after hours. The official explanation, a routine transfer gone awry, collapsed under the weight of its own improbability. As the scandal unfolded, uncomfortable connections between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein resurfaced with renewed intensity. Archives of photographs showing the men together at Palm Beach gatherings circulated widely. A former Mar-a-Lago employee's sworn statement describing Epstein's privileged access gained traction in mainstream reporting. Most damning was the resurfaced quote from Trump himself in 2002. "I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy, he's a lot of fun to be with. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." While other political figures rushed to explain their Epstein connections, Trump maintained an uncharacteristic silence. No midnight social media salvos. No impromptu press conferences. The absence of his typically immediate and forceful denials created a vacuum quickly filled by speculation. The crisis metastasized within Trump's base as unified support fractured into competing narratives. In online forums and conservative media outlets, once lockstep supporters diverged dramatically. Some called the disappearances evidence of a, quote, deep state conspiracy against Trump. Others questioned whether the missing files might contain revelations damaging to him. The remainder simply demanded answers, regardless of political consequences. Caroline Leavitt, tasked with defending the indefensible, found herself struggling to maintain message discipline. During a particularly contentious press briefing, she snapped at a reporter who pressed for Trump's response. "The president has addressed these ridiculous allegations numerous times." Next question. When footage emerged showing he had never directly addressed the file disappearance, Leavitt's credibility suffered another blow. As night fell on Washington, the crisis deepened. Congressional oversight committees issued subpoenas. Justice Department officials offered conflicting accounts. And ordinary Americans, watching this spectacle unfold, confronted an unsettling possibility that power might still shield the powerful from accountability, that truth, even in its most damning form, could simply be made to disappear. In the shadows of this growing scandal, the fundamental question remained unanswered. In a nation founded upon justice and transparency, who guards the evidence when the accused are those who control the vaults? As the Epstein documents scandal threatened to engulf Washington, a new constitutional crisis emerged that would test the very foundations of American democracy. Chief Justice John Roberts, a figure rarely drawn into public political confrontations, found himself thrust into the spotlight by circumstances that demanded a response. Trump's increasingly brazen calls for the impeachment of a federal judge who had ruled against his interests represented more than mere political frustration. They signaled a direct assault on judicial independence itself. Roberts, speaking from the marble sanctuary of the Supreme Court, delivered his rebuke with the measured precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The independence of the judiciary is not a privilege granted to judges, but a necessary safeguard for the rights of every American. Attempts to intimidate or control judicial decision-making represent a grave threat to constitutional order. The words landed like thunderclaps across Washington. In the West Wing, staffers scrambled to craft a response that wouldn't further inflame the confrontation while still satisfying Trump's demand for unconditional loyalty. Caroline Leavitt, trapped between institutional respect for the judiciary and her allegiance to Trump, attempted an impossible balancing act during her morning briefing. "The president respects the role of an independent judiciary," she claimed, her voice betraying the slightest tremor, "but also believes judges must be held accountable when they exceed their constitutional authority." Robert Dairo, witnessing this performance from his network studio, couldn't contain his disbelief. "What we're seeing," he told viewers, "is nothing less than an attempt to subordinate an entire branch of government to the whims of one man." The founders designed our system specifically to prevent this scenario. On Capitol Hill, the confrontation catalyzed an even deeper division. Congressional hearings meant to address human rights concerns quickly devolved into partisan warfare over judicial independence. Representative Luna found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending institutions she had previously criticized. "While I have my disagreements with many court decisions," she acknowledged during a tense committee meeting, "the answer cannot be to simply remove judges who rule in ways we disagree with." Outside Washington's power centers, ordinary Americans struggled to comprehend the stakes. Social media platforms amplified the most extreme voices, while nuanced legal analyses struggled to gain traction. The result was a dangerous simplification. Courts were either enemies of the people or last bastions of democracy, with little room for the complex truth that lay between. James Blanchard, observing the crisis from his diplomatic perspective, recognized patterns he had witnessed in nations sliding toward authoritarianism. First comes the delegitimization of the press, he noted grimly during a policy roundtable, then attacks on independent prosecutors, and finally, attempts to control the courts. We've seen this playbook before. As evening fell across the Capitol, Roberts' chambers received an unprecedented volume of threats, necessitating enhanced security measures. Yet the Chief Justice maintained his public schedule, a silent demonstration that intimidation would not achieve its intended effect. The confrontation laid bare a fundamental reality of American governance. Institutions are ultimately only as strong as the norms and principles that sustain them. When those norms are abandoned for political expediency, even the most carefully designed constitutional safeguards face existential challenges. In this moment of constitutional peril, the nation found itself forced to confront an uncomfortable question. What remains of democracy when its cornerstone institutions are treated not as essential guardians of liberty, but as obstacles to be overcome in the pursuit of power? As the constitutional crisis deepened, a parallel battle unfolded in America's cultural arena, where truth and power would be contested not through legal briefs, but through the cutting edge of satire. The vulnerability of Trump's carefully constructed public persona began to reveal itself, not in courtrooms, but on late-night television, and through the unfiltered commentary of media's most unflinching voices. Robert Dairo, standing before his network audience, abandoned the pretense of neutrality that had constrained mainstream journalism. "What we're witnessing," he declared, eyes fixed directly on camera, "is the desperate flailing of a man who has spent decades confusing wealth with wisdom and notoriety with respect." The emperor's new clothes have become transparent to all but his most devoted followers. While Dairo dismantled Trump's image with surgical precision, Jimmy Kimmel weaponized humor to similar effect. His nightly monologues transformed presidential missteps into viral moments that resonated far beyond their late-night time slot. Trump's rage-tweeting about judicial independence, Kimmel quipped to thunderous audience laughter, is like watching a toddler demand that gravity stop applying to his ice cream cone. The potency of this cultural counteroffensive was evident in Trump's response. No longer content to merely attack institutional critics, he now devoted considerable energy to personal vendettas against comedians and commentators. Caroline Leavitt found herself dispatched to morning shows not to defend policy positions but to denounce punchlines. The American people elected a president, not a punchline, she insisted on a particularly tense broadcast. These so-called satirists are undermining national cohesion with their divisive mockery. The response was immediate and merciless. Within hours, Leavitt's words had been remixed into counterpunch comedy across every platform. The administration that had once masterfully manipulated media narratives now found itself perpetually on defense against cultural forces it couldn't control. Dairo, observing this shift, noted its historical significance. Authoritarian impulses typically falter when they become objects of ridicule rather than fear, he explained to viewers. What begins as comedy often crystallizes into clarity for the public, the recognition that the powerful are rarely as imposing as they wish to appear. Behind closed doors, Trump's fury at these cultural critics reportedly exceeded even his rage at judicial obstacles. Sources close to the administration described late-night rants about ratings and demands for regulatory retribution against networks that platformed his satirical tormentors. Yet each attempt to silence the mockery only amplified it. When Trump threatened Kimmel with consequences for disrespecting the presidency, the comedian responded by dedicating an entire week of programming to reciting the former president's most grammatically challenged social media posts, set to dramatic orchestral accompaniment. Underneath the entertainment value of this spectacle lay a profound commentary on power in America. The very qualities that had once made Trump impervious to conventional political attacks, his shamelessness, his unpredictability, his disdain for norms, now rendered him uniquely vulnerable to satirical deconstruction. When governance becomes reality television, observed Dairo in a particularly incisive commentary, then television becomes our most effective lens for examining governance. The satirists have become our truth-tellers, precisely because the truth has become so outlandish that only satire can adequately frame it. The laughter that echoed across America carried with it something more potent than mere amusement. It represented the reclaiming of narrative power by voices outside Washington's corridors of influence, a reminder that in a democracy, even the most formidable political figures remain answerable to the court of public opinion and the jury of cultural critique. Beyond the glaring spotlights of late-night mockery and courtroom confrontations, a more insidious crisis was quietly engulfing America. The economic tremors from Trump's increasingly erratic trade policies had begun to reverberate through heartland communities with devastating precision. Factory closures in Michigan, grain silos standing empty in Iowa, and shipping containers stranded in harbors told a story that no amount of political theater could obscure. James Blanchard, whose diplomatic tenure had been defined by carefully nurturing the U.S.-Canada relationship, watched in barely contained horror as decades of goodwill evaporated into acrimony. What took generations to build, he noted with palpable regret, has been dismantled in mere months through policy decisions that appear to be guided more by impulse than strategy. The data supported his assessment. Consumer prices had surged by double digits in sectors most affected by trade disruptions, while manufacturing orders plummeted to recession-level indicators. These weren't abstract economic concepts, but lived realities for millions of Americans now facing layoffs, foreclosures, and impossible choices between groceries and medication. Against this backdrop of economic uncertainty, the depth of America's legal and institutional crisis continued to unfold in ways that defied precedent. Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna stood before a hastily assembled press conference, her expression stoic but her words incendiary. The systematic disappearance of documents related to the Epstein investigations represents either catastrophic incompetence or calculated corruption. The American people deserve to know which it is. Her concerns crossed traditional partisan boundaries, creating unlikely alliances as fundamental questions of accountability eclipsed routine political positioning. The judiciary, that final bulwark against unchecked power, found itself simultaneously under siege and scrutinized for its own failures of transparency. In living rooms across America, citizens watched these developments with a growing sense that the nation had entered uncharted waters. The predictable rhythms of democratic governance, the peaceful transitions of power, the respect for judicial independence, the basic adherence to truth in public discourse, could no longer be taken for granted. They had instead become contested terrain in a struggle whose outcome remained dangerously uncertain. Caroline Leavitt, still faithfully carrying the administration's banner despite diminishing returns, insisted that these concerns represented nothing more than the death throes of an obsolete order. What pessimists call instability, she declared during a contentious cable interview, is actually the necessary disruption that precedes genuine renewal. The American people voted for transformation, not timidity. Yet even as she spoke these words, internal polling showed a nation increasingly exhausted by constant crisis. The appetite for spectacle had been replaced by a yearning for competence. The thrill of norm-breaking had given way to nostalgia for norms that once seemed restrictive but now appeared protective. Robert Dairo, ever the analytical observer, identified this shift with characteristic precision. We're witnessing the collision between personality-driven politics and the fundamental need for institutional stability, he explained. Charisma may win elections, but governance requires consistency. Leadership, in its most essential form, means creating certainty amid chaos, not manufacturing chaos amid certainty. As darkness settled over Washington's monuments, those silent stone witnesses to previous national crises overcome, the questions hanging in the evening air carried weight beyond partisan calculation. Could the center hold? Would truth reassert its claim on public discourse? Or had America's experiment with self-governance entered its twilight phase, giving way to something darker and less accountable? The answer would not be found in proclamations from podiums or decisions from benches, but in countless individual choices about what kind of nation Americans wish to inhabit. For in the final analysis, Democracies reflect the character of their citizens, their tolerance for deception, their demand for accountability, and their willingness to place principle above personality when history calls them to choose. This saga reveals a harsh truth. When political power is exploited for spectacle and self-preservation, truth becomes the first casualty. The resilience of democracy rests on exposing deception, demanding accountability, and valuing judicial independence. In a world where misinformation and division threaten societal fabric, it falls to vigilant voices like Cal Morgan's to cut through the noise and champion integrity, reminding us that the true battle for America's soul is fought not with tweets or tantrums, but with unwavering commitment to truth and justice.